But now they're actually breaking data down by gender. So when companies like Staymetrics, which is 10th Street, they'll say, hey, we broke this down by gender. The American Transportation Research Institute has now broken down their crash causation study and found that male commercial drivers are 20% more likely to be involved in a crash in every statistically significant area. We've also looked at detention time, women more susceptible to detention, not because they're women, but because they're being team-oriented and collaborative and not going in there and pounding on the desk.
You're listening to Freight Famous, presented by Rose Rocket, bringing you the people that make trucking move. From behind the scenes into the limelight. Here's your host, Justin Bailie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Freight Famous, a podcast produced by Rose Rocket. New episodes of Freight Famous will be released about twice a month. On this podcast, we talk with guests about how they build, scale, and automate their trucking and transportation businesses. I'm your host, Justin Bailie, co-founder at Rose Rocket, and today I'm thrilled to announce my guest, Ellen Voie. Ellen is an internationally recognized speaker and authority on gender diversity and inclusion for women trucking in non-traditional careers in transportation. She's been invited to speak to audiences across the world, including in Sweden, the US, Vietnam, and France, just to name a few. Voie founded the Women in Trucking Association in 2007 and currently serves as the nonprofit organization's president and CEO. Voie also currently serves on the Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee to provide recommendations and advice to the FMCSA on motor carrier safety programs and motor carrier safety regulations. Voie has a long history in the trucking industry, and after starting a family, she used her background to become a freelance transportation consultant to carriers in Wisconsin, licensing and permitting trucks for more than 16 years. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
I am out of breath from that intro, so thank you for providing all of that. There's a lot there. So I think, and we talked a little bit as we started the show, really interested in you as a person and would like to understand, your background and how did you get into the trucking industry?
So a lot of times when I ask women, especially if they were looking at careers in transportation in high school or college, typically women say no. And I was one of those. I actually wanted to get into broadcast journalism. But in high school, I took shop class, and I took welding and woodworking and engine maintenance and drafting. And so I got a job after high school at a steel fabricating plant doing material handling, drafting. And one day they came to me and they said, we'd like to move you into traffic, and we'll send you to school for traffic and transportation management. And just like that started my career in the trucking industry. Got my diploma in traffic and transportation management. I was the assistant traffic manager, then traffic manager, and then I used those skills like reading tariffs and applying for authority and auditing freight bills and things like that to do consulting, as you mentioned, while I raised my family. So it gave me a good skill.
And then, why start Women in Trucking? What was it is it something that sort of happened during that period, or you learned during that period, or what was it that brought you to that moment, I suppose?
Well, I was recruited by Schneider National, and my job was manager of recruiting and retention programs, and that was corporate level initiatives. So they said, figure out how to attract and retain non-traditional groups. And one of the groups they wanted me to focus on was women. And at the time, I was getting my pilot's license, and I belonged to a women's aviation organization. And it struck me, why isn't there something for women in the trucking industry? So I put together board of directors, got all the paperwork completed, and as you said, in March of 2007, the Women in Trucking Association was born. We're a little over 15 years old. And
so what does it mean to, sort of just, what is the women's, and I understand it's a not-for-profit and kind of the stuff we read in the bio, but maybe on a deeper level, what does it mean to sort of engage with women in trucking, or what is it?
Well, first of all, let me reiterate our mission, because our mission has never changed. It's to encourage the employment of women in the trucking industry, to address obstacles that might keep women from succeeding or even entering the industry, and thirdly, to celebrate success. In other words, tell their stories. And so really, we're a resource. We're a trade professional organization. We have individual and corporate members. So we're supported by the industry, which pays dues. So people can join Women in Trucking Association as a driver or as a corporation and pay dues, and that's how we're funded. But what do they get in response for their dues? they get a resource. So we do a lot of research, we do white papers. We want to find out as much information about what brings women into the industry, what makes women leave the industry, what makes women stay with a carrier or with a company. And so we do a lot of research, and then we provide that research to our members at no charge. It's part of being a member of Women in Trucking.
So I'm interested in all of those points. So what does attract women into the space?
Well, first of all, it's money and stability. Women know that even through COVID, we still had jobs. And they saw that whether you're driving a truck or owning a truck or in the boardroom or safety director, we had jobs in the trucking industry. They didn't go away. So stability is a huge issue. Also, when women work in traditionally male-populated environments, they make more money. And for drivers, they make the exact same amount of money as their male counterparts because you're not paid less just because you're a female. So stability of the job and the money are what bring women into the industry.
It's so interesting, that note about sort of pay equality. How does equality look in other areas of the industry?
Well, we really don't have salary information for safety directors or CEOs or things like that. I wish we did. But I can tell you for drivers, it's the same. And typically women actually out-earn men in many areas because of working smarter, not harder. But again, when women work in traditionally male-populated work environments, they make more money. So as a safety director, as a dispatcher, as a CEO, you will make more money in the trucking industry than you will in maybe teaching or, a traditionally female environment.
Why is that?
Because typically these jobs have always paid more. So when women break into these jobs, I shouldn't say break in, but when women enter these jobs, the standard has already been set. So, and you've seen driver pay has gone up dramatically in the last 3 years. I mean, you're always seeing companies announcing a new pay increase or bonuses and things like that. So it's a good time to be in trucking.
From a driver's perspective, or just a driving perspective, is like what's the percentage of women driving trucks, and is that growing and shrinking? And do you have any data around that?
Absolutely. We do the Women in Trucking Index. And when I started Women in Trucking, according to the Department of Labor, we were about 3% female drivers. But our recent WIT index showed that we were almost at 14%. Now, if you take the Department of Labor data, Department of Labor calls it truck drivers / sales delivery drivers. And so that included straight trucks. Maybe you're delivering chips, for Frito-Lay at a grocery store. So we wanted to break it into tractor trailer. And so when we ask for Class A information. And so it's about 14%. And I will tell you, even though it's money that brings women into the industry, 83% of women who come into the trucking industry as drivers do so at the urging of a family member or friend. And that's really important because it means that they already know what the lifestyle is like. So women aren't leaving because of work-life balance. Women aren't leaving because of home time. Women know what to expect when they come into the job because most of them have some exposure to the trucking industry in advance.
Why are they leaving?
Safety.
Got it.
If they don't feel safe, then, and safety is 3 areas. Safety is how well maintained is the equipment, because nobody wants a truck broken down on the side of the road. Also, what is the company's culture? If it's the weather is inclement or there's a tornado or a hurricane or maybe a protest area, what does the company say if you say, well, I don't feel comfortable going into that area? Do they let you wait or divert to another area? And then the third part is, where are you sending your drivers? Are they in a part of town that might have, activity that is not safe, or maybe an unlit warehouse, or, no security, things like that. So those 3 things are the safety culture. So if women don't feel safe, that's what makes women leave.
But isn't that not dissimilar to men, though, in that way? Wouldn't they have sort of the similar, maybe the third less so, but the first 2 certainly I think would apply. Isn't that somewhat gender agnostic, or and is there? And I guess where I'm trying to go with this is there other components of safety for women in the space feeling? I don't even know the right word to put this. Is there? So we touched about these are sort of physical safety components, but right. Is there a sort of an emotional safety aspect to this, or or not feeling heard. Like safety can kind of be, we talk a lot about it in the physical world in trucking, but safety has a total soft skill component to it as well. Is there anything around that kind of comes up, or you see as a strong indicator towards women, leaving or feeling, sort of negative about the industry?
Well, there's a big difference. Any challenges that men face, women face as well, but it's prioritized differently. So for women, safety is much higher. Women are more vulnerable. But there's also the subject of harassment. And we've done some study. We actually have a white paper on harassment. And so, again, women are more vulnerable, but women are typically more situationally aware about not walking between trucks, not parking in the back. A lot of them will, fuel and eat at one truck stop and then pull into the next one and sleep so that no one knows there's a solo female. So remember, harassment is a higher issue, a higher priority for female drivers than it is for male drivers. That's
an interesting. I mean, I think to women, that's like not interesting at all. And any women listening to this be like, this is the most obvious thing. But it was not long ago, and I was walking with my wife in an underground parking garage, and I'm trying to remember anyway, she basically had said to me, and again, this is just shows how I think daft I am possibly, but she'd said, you've never had to think about being in a parking lot and looking behind you or being afraid when you're walking, or these, and it's true. It's never, you get moments where you're like, that's kind of weird, that's sketchy, but it's not deeply fearful from a man's perspective. And she said, it's almost every single time I do it, this is what happens. So I think it feels almost like it requires bravery to do that, which feels like a bit of an ask of somebody, right? Like if you're going to do this work, you have to be brave. But then as I say that out loud, I think if we're speaking specifically of just driving truck, you kind of have to be brave to do that, no matter who you are, because it is a pretty dangerous job I guess unto itself, just for the regular, again, stuff, as you said, equipment, accidents, these types of things.
Well, I will tell you that, like I said, women are more situationally aware. So we have self-defense classes by Debbie Gardner of the Survive Institute at all of our events to teach women how to handle themselves, how to protect themselves, how to, to avoid being put in that situation. But also, we have an anti-harassment employment guide that we give to our corporate members. And we talk about an expectations exchange. So if someone tells a joke or uses a term that I find offensive, I have an obligation to say, please don't use that around me. And I'm going to set those boundaries. Also, if we're sending drivers out maybe in a team or a training situation, also setting the boundaries on, hey, let's not talk about politics because one of us is conservative and the other is liberal. Or maybe let's not talk about religion because we have opposite viewpoints. So let's set the boundaries in advance and say, this is something that is off limits. And so if you violate those boundaries, then I'm going to report you and say, you've used a term I don't like, or you've told a joke more than once that offends me. So, I mean, it's really about setting boundaries. It's all about respect. If drivers and people just would respect each other, we wouldn't have these issues.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because then that goes back to the thing you've spoken about around safety, around culture. So it's not just, will you send me out in a snowstorm, but if I report this, will I feel empowered to report this, or will I be afraid to report this? And again, that is somewhat gender agnostic to a degree as well. But I think it's a good framework for all. And to your point, exactly, we could really avoid a lot of things with boundaries sort of put in place and some mutual respect that goes a long way.
Absolutely, yes.
So talk about and I think our listeners will be really interested in this. How does one attract women? And maybe let's do this in two ways. So I want to think about this from a driver point of view, and I'd like to just think about this like a general diversity, sort of more of a diversity inclusion kind of question. So if I'm thinking about drivers, is there something, and maybe it's just the antithesis of the things you had said ahead of time, but if I'm a company and I'm looking to attract more drivers, and I certainly am if I'm in the trucking industry, and there's a very large contingent of the population that is pretty underrepresented proportionally based on the numbers you just gave me, that seems like that's fertile ground for possible employment opportunities. So how do I do this? How do I put myself in a position where I will be a more attractive employer to women?
So first of all, ask your female drivers, if you have any, what you're doing right and what you could do differently. So some of the things are so subtle because the trucking industry has always been a very male-populated environment. So when you are always doing things the same way, you're not thinking. For example, uniforms. So many companies have uniforms that are men's uniforms, whether the shirts or the pants. And so if you ask your female drivers, women don't feel comfortable in men's clothing. So make sure that you have women's clothing. Also, trucks were always designed for men. They're changing that, and the companies are very much trying to make them more adaptable. Women have shorter arms and legs, and typically wider hips. And so you'll hear stories of especially shorter women from 20 years ago who had to sit on pillows to see over the dash, things like that. So this industry has to be more accommodating and more flexible to make women feel just as comfortable. But also, we have a recruiting guide. And in our recruiting guide, we talk about what graphics to use and what words to use. Women want words that like team-oriented, collaborative, things like that. They want a company that has their back. Also a company that cares about their safety. Men at a company are looking for pay equity from their company, but that's not what women are looking for. Women are looking for a company that cares about them. And so maybe use those kind of terms. And here's a little secret that we have in a recruiting guide. Very unscientific, but I started listening to female drivers talk about their motorcycles. So I went on our Facebook page, and we have about 11,000, mostly female drivers on there. And when I asked the question, over 80% of the female CDL holders had a motorcycle. So think about the kind of woman you're trying to attract, and then go to those places. Go to a charity run, a Harley ride, or something like that. Those are the kind of women who feel comfortable in the trucking industry.
I'm just sort of marinating on that one for a second and trying to. I think, yeah, I'm trying to draw the straight line through that. Okay, that's a great tip actually, and that's actually really helpful. So I guess then the other side is we think about women in transportation sort of as a whole. So maybe outside of just driver, is it really the same application? Maybe minus the motorcycle piece. Like, is it still the same? Does that apply? Does that blanket the both sort of sides of the? And if it does, then that means it kind of blankets all industries across the board anyway, I guess.
So you need to have an environment that is inclusive, and that means that you have to try, okay? So it means in your recruiting, where are you recruiting, what, again, terms and graphics, but also what is your culture like? So women are more risk averse in the boardroom and in the cab of the truck. So maybe a conversation involving maybe mergers and acquisitions, women are going to ask more questions and take longer to decide. Also, the decision-making process for men is to take, let's say, 5 options and narrow it down to 1 or 2 and make a quick decision, where women are going to look at those 5 options and then say, did I miss anything? Maybe call some friends and say, what are your thoughts on this? She's going to take longer to make a decision, may come to the same conclusion, but women do things differently. So if your culture values quick decision making in a hierarchical type environment, it's not as inclusive for women. So it really depends on what the company culture is like. And the more women you bring in leadership, the more you'll change the culture.
Yeah, I guess that was my follow-up question to that. It's how do you, so I think it's again, it's almost embarrassing to think like how, I don't know, how new to the point of that, like diversity's been a thing. It's been spoken about for quite a while. I mean, you started women in trucking, 15 years ago at this point, but it's like, it's only really now, I think, coming into a much more broad light, and I still feel like it's got a long way to go. And I guess my question is around how do you authentically, and you maybe just answered it, but how do you authentically do this versus make it seem like you're doing it as a marketing gimmick just to attract more, women? Because that's kind of what right. I feel like. I feel like sometimes it's just I don't know, it's fake, if you will, almost, Correct. Where it's not actually real and deep. So how do you talk to organizations about making it a systemic change that will endure and not just be a campaign?
It has to come from the top. It has to. It cannot come from the bottom up. If the senior leadership doesn't believe in diversity and inclusion, it's not going to happen. So again, start at the top, but also track numbers. When I ask people, like, how many many women have applied for the job? Not how many did you hire, but how many applied. If you're not tracking those kind of numbers, and say you have an opening and you hire someone, but you didn't have any women applying, then you're not putting your recruit ad in the right place, you're not using the right graphics or the right words in your recruiting ad, and there's lots of science around how to attract women versus how to attract men. And also, women can tell if you walk the walk. They'll ask other women, what is it like working there? You can also, if it's a publicly traded company, you can look in their reports and see what actions are they really taking for diversity inclusion, or is it just, like you said, I'll say window dressing, but just saying that you're doing it instead of really caring.
So going back into your experience in the space, so when you were, you were a traffic manager at a fabrication company and kind of moved into working with organizations, what was your experiences like, personally?
Well, I can tell you it was a lot different. So when I first started, it was before deregulation, and before deregulation, it meant that everyone had to go by tariffs and had to use the same freight rates. So working at a steel fabricating plant, our material handling equipment was hard to harm. I mean, it wasn't breakable. It was heavy, so it was very expensive to haul, and it was typically truckloads. But think about this. Every carrier out there had to charge the same rate. So what did they go by? They either went by where they delivered, or they went by service, or they used bribes. And I'm not kidding. I was bribed many times to use certain companies, and it's changed a lot.
Can I just pause there for a quick second?
Sure.
Just interesting, because I came into the industry past regulation. What's a bribe worth? What do you get for what? Like, what's the currency? Like, how much is this? Like, how much is this? Is it like a suitcase of cash, or is it like a dinner at Applebee's? Like, what are you talking about here?
So I live in Wisconsin, so I was actually offered dates with Brewers, our baseball team. Yeah. I was offered pot, drugs.
Weed? Yeah.
I was offered.
Sorry, do you remember how much? Like a joint, or like? Sorry, it's just mad. I'm just trying to build a fun story in my mind here.
No, I actually didn't know because I kicked them out.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
I kicked them out.
That's a ballsy offer, by the way. You're offering you're already bribing, and you're using at that point like pretty offside drugs as the bribe.
Well, it was funny because I was very, very young. I was only 19.
Yeah.
And so when they'd come in and the receptionist would hand them my card, and I was the traffic manager, and I had finished my diploma in traffic and transportation management. Yes, I was young, but I knew what I was doing. And when they'd come in and I'd say, my name's Ellen Voie, and they'd say, is that Miss or Mrs.? And I'd say, that's Ms. to you. Because first of all, what does my marital status have to do with how you're going to treat me? And secondly, they really didn't know what to do. I mean, there were no women as traffic managers, especially at a steel fabricating plant. So, I mean, it was very subtle. But yeah, I never got as far as to find out what quantity.
Right, okay. And that's a fair answer. Yeah.
But it was pretty bad. It was interesting because they really didn't know how to handle a female traffic manager. Yeah, and I'd go to a meeting, and they'd all be sitting there smoking their cigars and drinking their brandy, and and I'm like, hey, what are we going to learn tonight? And they're like, learn,
Right. Yeah. It's a sort of a bygone. It's a bygone era, right? In I think many ways. I'm sure it's still out there, but you don't see it as much anymore. So to past that. How did it continue to go for you?
Well, so I did consulting while I raised my family, and during that time I got my bachelor's and then my master's in communication at the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point, and I was married to an owner-operator, and I did my master's thesis on the complex identities of women married to professional drivers. When he's home, she's part of a couple, family unit. But then when he's gone, she's mom and dad. You can never RSVP. You talked about what it was like years ago. drivers were gone for weeks at a time, and families just accepted that. And we didn't have the kind of communication that we do now. We didn't have Zoom meetings. We didn't have, cell phones. I mean, if you wanted to reach a driver, you had to call their dispatcher and leave a message and wait for them to call you back. So things have come a long way. So the communication process is much better. But I can tell you that it was pretty tough. Anyway, kids are fine. I'm no longer married, and it's all good.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting snippet. If you don't mind, want to just kind of go there for a second, because I think that we hear a lot about the drivers on the road. You hear a lot about the hardship of that and how long that is on the road. But then it's and this is a bit of a tale of sort of there's a bit of a man and woman tale here as well. Is that I think you said it perfectly. It's the mom playing mom and dad back home for, to your point, weeks on end. And back then he said there wasn't, and if you kind of go back to what you were mentioning earlier around attracting women, and I think this is it's a well-known fact that women do respond very positively and are wired for community. And so that'd be pretty lonely, I bet, and it must have been, a lot to do. And I guess did you find a sort of a community, or have you since found ways to support sort of women wives of drivers, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I actually was very active in an organization called Families of Truckers Support Group. They're no longer in existence, and part of that is because of the technology and because it's easier to stay in touch. And besides, the job has changed so much more. Drivers aren't out for weeks at a time like they were then. But when you're the spouse of an owner-operator, or of a driver, you're not a couple, but you're not single. You can't go out with your single friends because you're married, but you can't go out with your married friends because you don't have someone with you. And you could never RSVP to a wedding because you didn't know if they'd be home, if he would be around. And you'd get invited to things, and they expected you to come as a couple. And so it was just really, it's not an easy life. And I actually wrote a book called Marriage in the Long Run, about what it's like being in a trucking family, and it's a tough life, but it's gotten a lot easier because they don't keep drivers out for weeks at a time like they used to, and a lot more regional, local jobs. The industry has changed a lot.
I think of how hard it is I have 100 kids, and I've also been divorced, and so I'm remarried now, and relationships at the best of times are incredibly difficult. And so when you kind of put that sort of distance between you, and resentment hardens the heart, right? And so I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a lot of that building up. So maybe hence the outcome, and maybe other reasons we don't need to get into today. But I can just see, again, it's got a bit of a compound effect to it. You would think, right? It's difficult in the tactical day-to-day. Get the kids to school, can't RSVP for things, but then the actual the relationship unto itself would be very, very challenging to keep in a place that is, trending at you think about how can we keep our relationship at 10 out of 10? That right there, you're just trying to stay above water almost, and maybe if you get some momentum going, he's gone for a few weeks, or if things aren't going so well and you have unresolved, more likely, then he's gone for a few weeks, and so things are again left to simmer, and resentment sets in. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
the outcome is almost inevitable. You would think, right?
Right. But you know what? The couples, there are so many wonderful marriages in the trucking industry. One of the things that my professors told me when I did my thesis was, it's not the time and distance apart that keeps couples together, it's their values. So think about that. I mean, because, hey, you could be working in an office and home every night and still cheat on your spouse. So it's really about your values. And there are such wonderful marriages in the trucking industry because supportive husband and wife, and it's just, it's really about your values. It's not about the time and distance apart, I can tell you that. Yeah,
I think that's a really nice way to put that. And so so from the time that you started in the space, or going back, what has been some of the more noticeable, impactful, and positive changes that you've seen kind of happen in the industry for women?
the biggest change that I've seen since 15 years ago, I would stand in front of groups, and first of all, there was no data. Nobody kept data. Women were, quote unquote, statistically insignificant, whether it was in the boardroom, the safety directors, drivers, whatever. Nobody had data on safety or anything. The second thing is, carriers would tell me all the time, oh, Ellen, we just hired the best person. We don't care about their age, their ethnicity, or their gender. And then I'd start pointing out like, oh, really? Okay, well, how come, your uniforms are all designed for men? How come you don't have women's restrooms? How come trucks are designed for men? Started pointing out that it wasn't a level playing field. And then as, I'd go to any meeting and I'd raise my hand and I'd go, do you have that broken down by gender? And I think people started getting tired of me asking that question, but now they're actually breaking data down by gender. So when companies like Stay Metrics, which is 10th Street, they'll say, hey, we broke this down by gender. The American Transportation Research Institute has now broken down their crash causation study and found that male commercial drivers are 20% more likely to be involved in a crash in every statistically significant area. We've also looked at detention time. Women are more susceptible to detention, not because they're women, but because they're being team-oriented and collaborative and not going in there and pounding on the desk. And some recent research we found is that female commercial drivers are being inspected less often than their male counterparts. So we're digging into that to find out why. Is it because they're choosing safer carriers? Is it the equipment? What is the difference? So the two things are, companies are actually trying to bring more women in purposefully, and secondly, we're getting a lot more data to prove why you want more women at all levels.
So are you suggesting that the introduction of this data has been, sort of critical because it's allowing people to make more informed decisions, and one that's not necessarily driven just by, well, we need to have more women because that's what we keep hearing. This is actually, there's reasons to do this. There's statistical relevance to hiring women, and it sounds like in many cases, statistical advantages to hiring women.
Well, think about this. Women are more risk averse.
Yeah.
Who do you want maneuvering 80,000 pounds down the road? Someone who is driven by testosterone, which encourages risk-taking and encourages winning, or someone who is driven by estrogen, which is team-oriented and collaborative and risk-averse. Who do you want in commandeering 80,000 pounds?
I'll tell you who I want running our countries. Forget just driving trucks up the road. So I mean, I say it often at home. It's like I really do, and I mean this. It's a true statement. Is I really would be, and I hope I get to see it in my lifetime, is I would love to see the world run by women at least political levels at the highest order. If 18 of the G20 were run by women, I've just got a lot more faith in the future of humanity. And I mean that. I know that's an extreme statement, but I'm very serious when I say that. So yeah, and I think I go back to your inspection, like the first thing you said, like they get inspected less. I'm like, well, if I'm an inspector, and I've got an option to look at two trucks, and one's driven by a man, one's driven by a woman, I just trust, to your point, that the woman is following the rules, doing the right work, and not to your. I guess it actually comes down to that they're not driven by testosterone, and they're just less risk taking. I guess. So it totally makes sense.
I also hear from companies, and I can't quantify this, but I hear that women are often better with the equipment, often better with customers, often easier to train, and better with paperwork. So if women are traditionally more on top of the paperwork, then the inspectors know that and think, well, she's going to have her paperwork up to date, everything's in order, so we'll just pass her through. Well,
and think about that. So for my fleet owners listening here, like think about that in terms of just managing paperwork. As important as that is to you getting paid, to all of the execution of it, to having the PODs and all the things in a sort of a timely, organized manner. I feel like I know who I'm putting my money on to make that happen. So I think there's some obvious benefits to the employer. Are there obvious benefits to women to be in this space? So sort of like we're kind of looked at this through the lens of, hey, you're an employer, this will work well for you. Are there obvious benefits to women that are maybe different than they would be for men?
No, women come in because they know the pay equity is there, and you have a lot of control over your pay based on what loads you're taking, how often you want to run, how much time you want to take off, what you're hauling, what's on that trailer behind you. Is it munitions or hazardous, things like that. So you have a lot of control over the kind of money you can make. And so I think that's what, not just the stability of the job, but the fact that you can make some choices that will increase your income in this industry considerably.
Are women then, based on like what you've told me in our 35 minutes together, makes it very obvious to me why women would be an excellent hire. And again, we've been talking a lot around the driver role. So I'm assuming most organizations, at least the ones that you're speaking to, are aware of this. Does that therefore make women in very high demand into this space, would you say?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I can tell you that probably 5 or 6 years ago, companies were looking at women as an untapped market. They just wanted a driver. But they're seeing the value that women bring as safer, less risk-taking, things like that. So now they're actively recruiting women, where I didn't see that 10, 15 years ago. They felt that it was 50% of the population, and only at the time maybe 5 or 6% of the driving fleet, and they thought, well, here's an untapped market. Now they're actually seeing the value that women bring, which to me is what I've been pushing for 15 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I even think I made the similar comment, 15 minutes ago. So it's like as we move through this, you start learning that it's not just an untapped market, but it's an untapped market that has a tremendous upside, I think, for everybody involved. So in terms of your organization, how you sort of mentioned how companies can participate. What's the best way that you think about the companies supporting, or who are you looking for members? Like, let's give a bit of a plug here, and how can we help you here?
So anyone can be a member if you support our mission. And I have to tell you, 15% of our members are men. 85% of our members are women, because it's called Women in Trucking. But if you support our mission, I would say join, and then we will support you. So whether you're a driver or a student, we have mentoring programs for students. We have lots of resources for drivers. We do our annual salute to women behind the wheel. We're giving away a truck. Again, this year, Aero Truck Sales has donated a truck for us. We have a driver ambassador program where our driver ambassador, Kaylee McCall, pulls our trailer around the country, and in the trailer there's a simulator, there's a hands-on learning environment, and so there's lots of ways that companies, not only using our resources and our white papers, and I have to mention this, our biggest event of the year is coming up in November, and that is our Accelerate Conference and Expo. We have it live in Dallas at the Hilton Anatole in November 13th through 15th. But also, we will have a virtual conference for people who can't make it in person, and that will be in December. So our conference, for men or women, but it's all about the transportation industry. And our conference is different than most trucking events. First of all, it's 85% women. But secondly, it's very positive. There's a very I am woman, hear me roar, attitude and atmosphere. Like, we're going to change the world. We're going to change this industry. So there's an excitement, and there's like an activity in the room that just builds other women up. And you don't see that at a trucking industry event. Usually you go to a conference and it's like, oh, woe is me, government regulations, fuel prices, driver, insurance, things like that. That's not what our conference is about. And any of the speakers would be, pertinent to anyone. I mean, we have everything from negotiation skills to fraud detection to, branding yourself and communication styles. So I would say check out our conference on our website, womenintrucking.org, and just click on the Accelerate.
This is very refreshing. If I were sort of to pick a word to sum up our conversation today, it would be refreshing. I would also say to anybody listening, this will be a 100%, maybe on my side, if anything, non-edited podcast. You've been incredibly concise. You speak very well. It's clear that you do speaking, and I can see why people have invited you to speak all around the world. Really articulate, super informative today. I learned a lot, and I think our listeners will too. And just to double down on that, let's everybody check out what Ellen's doing, and I think there's a lot of there's a long way to go here, but it really feels like you've got some great momentum behind you, and I think the timing is just excellent. I think we are in an era and a moment in time, I think, where there's a real opportunity for an exponential growth curve to what you're working on and in the field. And thank you for sharing that with me today, and thanks for sharing it with everybody else. Lots of good data. Lots of good stuff. Again, super articulate and incredibly refreshing. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, be well, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, Ellen. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Rose Rocket podcast called Freight Famous. Bye.